so much, all of you, for coming this evening. Not a very nice one either. Lovely to see so many faces, I know. I had difficulty deciding which passage to read, but I wanted you to get a little idea of the exchange between the two main protagonists, who are Freud and his young patient. He has seen her once before, but very briefly, and this is the first meeting when the father brings her to Freud in 1900 in Vienna. So this is just a couple of pages at the beginning, towards the beginning of the book. He beckons for the girl to enter his office and watches the father give her a gentle push. He ushers the elegant girl in, nods to the frowning father, who looks as though he might break down and weep, and closes the door firmly on him. "Make yourself comfortable," he says to the girl, and indicates the ottoman, a gift from a grateful patient. The girl eyes it with suspicion and perches there stiffly, as though sitting on eggshells, her back ramrod straight, feet planted neatly side by side, hands firmly clutching her reticule, as though she were afraid someone might snatch it from her. Since the girl's first visit to him, she's seen many doctors who've not been able to help her. Her behavior has become increasingly troublesome at home. She needs to understand, the father maintains, that her demands are very rude and unreasonable, going even so far as to suggest he break off his friendship with old and dear friends of the family. She, who was so angelic, who looked after him with such devotion in his various illnesses, has become sullen and bad-tempered with both her parents, and her symptoms are worse, particularly the cough, the pains in her leg, the aphasia. He stares at her hands. Gestures tell us a great deal. He's learned from his favorite writers, as well as from Charcot, a visuel, who had the nature of an artist, a man who saw, who taught him not to take anything for granted, but to look and look again in order to understand. He thinks of Charcot saying, "La théorie, c'est bon, mais ça n'empêche pas d'exister." She has long-fingered hands with white knuckles and the nails bitten down to the quick. She looks as if a slight breeze could unseat her and carry her off. The doctor recalls his bashful patient, her E, who would blush with a desire to ravish every woman he saw, perhaps a more common feeling than is generally admitted to by those of his sex. She seems to stare with fascination at the lithograph he brought back from his year in Paris. "What's wrong with the girl?" she asks, gesturing towards the lithograph without looking at him. Taken aback for a moment, he stares at the beautiful Blanche Whitman, seeing her anew through this girl's eyes, her smooth shoulders and bodice indecently exposed, leaning back into the arms of Charcot's assistant, the lucky Dr. Babinski, surrounded by a group of staring men during one of Charcot's Tuesday lessons. "Too tightly laced," he deems it expedient to reply, and thinks of the talented Blanche, whom they call the queen of hysterics. When this girl finally directs her gaze towards him, her eyelids seem heavy, the long dark lashes weighing them down. Her eyes are large and wide-spaced like her father's, and lucent but sullen. He realizes with a little shock that this girl is in a rage. She gives him a blank but angry stare. He thinks of the English expression, "if looks could kill." For a moment he regrets not being able any longer to use hypnosis on a girl of this kind. It might be easier to get her to comply. He thinks of his early success with the mother whom he hypnotized, who could not feed her baby. He's been obliged to give it up, as unlike Charcot, he has often had difficulty putting his patients to sleep, which was perhaps a blessing in disguise, as it's forced him to come up with other, more lasting methods. He stares back at the girl and is about to explain his new method, what Breuer's former patient has aptly dubbed the talking cure, when she asks disconcertingly, looking around the room disdainfully, "Why do you have all these old statues?" The The psychoanalyst, he says, drawing himself up, like the archaeologist, must clear away layer after layer, as though digging down through a buried city, in order to reach the deepest layers of the patient's mind, to discover the secrets that lie buried there. He points to the Roman statue of a child on the table by his chair, and thinks of the city of Rome and how he both wants and fears to visit it. He's afraid of contracting an illness there in the summertime, which is when he's free to travel. How very interesting, she says in an inimitable tone, and peers at the statue, rather like a grande dame being led through a museum and glancing at the objects through a lorgnette. For a moment, he'd like to give her a shake. He remembers how easily Charcot had access to Blanche Whitman's memories of a traumatic childhood through hypnosis, her childish, unprotected body sexually abused again and again. He remembers Charcot saying, "Toujours la chose génitale, toujours, toujours," and wondering why, if the problem was always genital, no one ever mentioned it then.
Sheila, as you know, I think this is a terrific book. That's not a question. Let's start with the figure of Freud. When I taught Freud a few months ago in a graduate workshop, a literary workshop, I encountered some students who had such an animus against him that they almost didn't want to read it, and they were surprised when they read the text and ended up being interested in it and liking it. So I think that in our day, Freud evokes those split responses. On the one hand, it's totally irrelevant, it's not scientific, it's been completely displaced. On the other hand, a monumental figure of modernism and modern thought. And it seems to me almost that in recent years, Freud has been reclaimed more as a figure of literature than a figure of science.
Yes, yes, exactly. I mean, I taught this class last semester too, and I got, we did the 5 case histories, and at the beginning, the first case history we did was the Dora case, and I, came into the room and I said, well, what do you think? I'm interested in how you reacted to this case and how you reacted to Freud. And the first comment from these were freshmen, young woman who said, but he's so arrogant, he was so arrogant, and I said, well, yes, I agree with you, he was, and we talked about it, and I thought, oh my God, we were going to have to read the rest of these case histories, and if they really feel that this is not, as you say, not really worth reading, where are we going to go from here? But we did Little Hunts next, which a child's story, and they connected much more easily with that. First of all, Freud really likes the little boy much more than he ever liked Dora, I think.
Well, also, the strange thing about psychoanalysis at first was that it was mostly the creation of men who were looking at the disturbances of women, So naturally, there's a backlash and a question of, from a feminist point of view, of is this kind of manipulation and oppression? And at one point in your novel, you say something like, do men and women even speak the same language? So just to put you on the spot, do you think men and women do or don't speak the same language?
They can do sometimes, let's say, but yes, the question comes up in the book where I think my young patient is never called Dora because I wanted to have the freedom of just letting her be, but she does say at some point that she would find it easier to speak to a woman. She's 17, and she's talking about the fact that her father's mistress's husband, if you can figure that one out, has been making passes at her. So there's a moment where she said, you know, she could really probably discuss this more easily with a woman. And obviously that was probably something that came from my own experience.
Yes, and I noticed that in your previous novel, you have the similar situation of a younger woman who is taking care of an older man, and the older man is, and is in a sense sacrificing a great deal of herself to be doing this. Yeah, so there seems a kind of pattern of this younger woman, older man that you're working through in these novels.
Well, I'm sorry, you're thinking of...
the Bronte, yeah.
Oh, the Bronte, yes, yes. Yes, well, yes, Charlotte with her father.
Right.
And absolutely, and it's what was so remarkable was it was exactly the same situation, that Charlotte Bronte is sitting at the bedside of her father, just as young Dora, who was actually Ida Bauer, was sitting at the bedside of her father, who also had a cataract removed, and has really great difficulties with his eyes. So it was really almost exactly the same situation where these young girls had to sit for hours and hours in the dark beside this person who they were very close to. And it must have been, you know, very difficult, just boring, for one. Yes.
Well, but you managed to use that as a jumping off point for your own novels. In the novel, the girl seems to feel that Freud is trying to push her into marriage with her father's mistress's husband, Herr Z. Is there any evidence in Freud's case history that he was trying to do that?
Yes, yes. He actually, at one point, really suggested. He says that might be the best solution. You know, he could divorce his wife; they're not getting on. And I think it's not the only case that Freud actually did suggest things like that, and couples separated and remarried, and with usually disastrous sort of results.
But I sort of read that as Freud was being a provocateur and trying to put her in touch with her desires, whether she wanted to or not.
Well, that's possible too, Philip. There you're probably reading your own.
Yes, the subjective reading.
Being a provocateur par excellence.
Well, you know, you've been teaching Freud as a writer, and indeed, as was mentioned, as a fiction writer. In what way would you say that these case histories are fictions?
Well, in the sense that it seems to me that he allows his mind, as a fiction writer does, to embroider on the facts. He has certain facts, and he has wonderful facts, and he's very convincing because he gives us such original, you know, he knows how to find the precise detail that will make the text vivid for us. And then he goes from there, which the fiction writer does, or perhaps the non-fiction writer to some extent too, is able to think on the page. He does that.
He says that. He says, I keep trying to follow my mind and think on the page. And at one point he says something like, it's strange, I started out in neuroscience and now I'm writing these case histories and they're coming out more like short stories and they don't sound like science to me, you know? So he himself acknowledged that something was happening, that in effect you could read a lot of these case histories of Freud as mystery stories with puzzles and clues planted and so on.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And I think he was a great fan of Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes and read a lot of mystery stories. And they are extremely well constructed. If you read them from that point of view, he really seemed to know about technique. Of course, he was extremely well read, so it may come from that. But he had very sort of traditional taste.
Yes, he wasn't a modernist.
No.
But did you feel in any way that his writing style was influencing you when you were writing in his voice or anything like that?
No, not really, not really. The only thing that I did notice reading these case histories was that he has such a clear, direct voice,
Right.
a voice that seemed familiar to me, you
Yeah.
know, and that's the wonderful quality. And I suppose all of us as writers are aiming to do something like that. So you really feel that the writer is addressing you directly. And he does. I mean, at times he actually talks to you.
Absolutely, and it's very intimate. You could say it's very seductive voice, and it's very often self-skeptical. He'll say, "Well, I don't really think I figured this out," or something like that.
Yes, yes.
What's often intriguing about Freud is that on the one hand, he's very aware of our tendency to make fictions of our stories, and is very skeptical. And then there are these moments of almost dogmatic certainty where he'll make a leap to some conclusion, you know?
Yes, wonderfully brave he was, extremely brave. And we go with him because he does stop and acknowledge our misgivings along the way. I mean, it's
right.
a great lesson. And, well, he seems to have a sense of pacing, and he knows the moments where you're probably thinking, hey, this is a bit far-fetched, you know, is this possible? That, for example, in the Wolfman, this very rich Russian, is it possible that he at 18 months could have seen his parents having sex,
Right.
and that it could have had such an extraordinary result? And you know, but he acknowledges that.
Well,
Says,
yeah, well,
maybe I'm wrong, you know, this kind of thing.
Well, that's something you intimate. That's a wonderful case history of the Wolfman, but that's something that you intimate that in effect the patients get taught what Freud might be interested in, and then start producing that for him.
Yes.
So you have a moment in your book which is kind of a very bold, where you say that the girl is inventing dreams, writing them down, completely awake, not dreaming at all, and presenting them to Freud because Freud, she knows, would so much like to have a dream presented to him. So, do you have even the slightest evidence that this happened, or is this pure invention?
No, I really don't. Except that it did happen sometimes, because I've read about other patients. I don't know about with Dora. But these dreams are so perfect. I mean, we read them as so perfect. You know, there were all the elements. You know, the jewel box, which, as she says, I knew you were going to say that. When of course, yes, he makes the analogy. But the fire, the Bahnhof, you know, the train station, the trains, the father's death. You really do feel it. If you've been going to make up a Freudian dream, that was the one that you would make. And also, what I really wanted to do there was, I wanted to present this young woman, that she's not a victim.
She's a creative. She's creative. But you know, the other thing is that you know, what Freud could have said was, okay, you invented this, but the very way that you invented it is very indicative. You know, you're telling me a lot about your psyche, even though you didn't have this as a night dream.
Right.
You know?
Yes, of course, as is anything we write.
Yes.
Which, you know, obviously you can analyze from many.
So did you construct this like a mystery yourself? Did you hold off certain positions, points?
Yes. I mean, and that's the wonderful thing about the Dora case, that he little by little does trickle in the important points. And I try to do that too, so that you don't reveal everything right away. You know, obviously, you don't come on like Tosca, you know, the beginning of Tosca, with where you know, I just escaped from the Castel Sant'Angelo, and blah 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 blah. You don't get all the information conveyed immediately, that little by little, which was also makes sense, because you know, it takes a while for us to trust somebody enough to actually tell them the heart of our story. So I think it's, I hope anyway, believable that she would withhold some of the information. And at least Freud, for all his, you know, he harasses her and harangues her and keeps insisting that she's in love with this Herr K. But he does believe the story she tells.
He believes in it.
I felt that was very important for an adolescent where you're looking for your identity.
Yes, and at one point she thinks and eventually indicates to him that no, if she's fantasizing about anybody, it's Frau It's Frauke.
Yes.
It's you know, and Freud. This rings a bell because Freud has been interested in the theory of bisexuality, which he and Fliess have been batting back and forth, and so suddenly it moves away from a kind of heterosexual normal pattern, and you have on the one hand the girl being fascinated with the body of this woman, and on the other hand Freud being essentially infatuated with this very strange quack-like Dr. Fliess, you know.
Yes.
So this whole, so they balance each other out in this homoerotic way. Yeah.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, I did find a lot of things that were similar about the two, my two protagonists. And Freud too was quite hysterical. I mean, he
Yes.
says she's hysterical. I don't know how hysterical she was, but he certainly, you know, had fainting fits.
He would faint,
and
yes,
had
exactly.
angina and various physical, somatized basically.
Right.
As she obviously is doing, poor girl, or what else could she do? And then he, as Philip says quite rightly, he's madly writing these letters to a Fliess who is really basically a quack.
But they're like love letters because he needs
Yes.
he needs this friend who will receive his thoughts regardless of how we judge Fliess now. And this was a series of men that Freud had. First Gluck, then Charcot, then Breuer, then Fliess, you know, all of whom he kind of fell in love with in a way and then basically rejected at a certain point.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And then Jung probably, and he also got
Then the
forced
younger
by
man
the
who
years,
were betrayers,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, so did you, since you obviously have a great deal of respect for Freud, did you ever feel it was an impertinence to pretend to enter his mind and write from his point of view?
Yes, I did, of course. But I done it first. I probably, you know, having had the experience of doing it with Charlotte Bronte,
Yes.
who was also, for me anyway, you know, one of the greats, and Emily, to enter into Emily's mind, and of course you never enter into entirely. Obviously, you're finding a middle distance between your own fantasies and thoughts, or whatever, and this character that you've read about and that you have all this information about, and going from there. So yes, and I think I started out probably, I think my initial intention with this book was just simply to stay with the Dora character. I was going to just write it from her point of view, because I felt she did not have a voice in the case history. But then I got interested in Freud, and of course there was a great deal more information about him than there was about her.
And you could alternate. The chapters don't strictly alternate. Sometimes there'll be two chapters in one person's voice and then one or two in another. But essentially there is this alternation between the two voices.
Right, so I try to be fair to both of them. And they're both struggling in a way. Freud, in a sense, is still young. He's 44 at this point, and he doesn't have much money, and he needs patience.
Yes, and that's one thing that I think that you made it. I don't want to say you humanized or made him endearing because you show him at a vulnerable point. He doesn't have a professorship.
Right.
You know, a lot of people have rejected his first book. Hasn't sold very well. And he himself has a lot of doubts, you know. So there is a kind of, so you're giving us the vulnerable Freud in a way, not the eminence grise of the end, you know.
Right, right. Well, that's how I saw him. And I read his work up to the point where they meet, and I didn't necessarily read everything he had written after that, which would have been taking on too much. But I read everything, you know, that went into the making of this moment when these two people come together, and how they are able to both get something from the other one, actually.
Yes.
And he goes on, I don't want to give away the whole ending to the book, but things happen after this meeting. Of course, that's also my own, again, embroidery on the facts, but they did in fact happen.
Did you research what happened to her in the later years?
Yes, and I did. And there I was very lucky because I was able to find an interview with her son, Ida Bauer's son, who's a very famous man, who was the head of the opera in San Francisco. And I don't know that many people have put these things together, because obviously when he was alive, he's dead now, so we can write about him.
With impunity.
Yes, say whatever we want. But and when he was alive, obviously, I don't think he wanted anyone to know that this Dora case was his mother. I mean, who would want your mother to be, analyzed so directly, put down on paper by Freud?
Well, one thing you show in the book is that that psychoanalysis is a genuine collaboration. That it's something that happens, between the two of them. So knowing that your husband is also a psychologist, was there some collaboration here?
Well, obviously, I did ask my husband to read the book and tell me if I had, made any gross errors because I have done an analysis, so I've seen this from the other side of the couch, but he obviously is sitting on the other side.
Right.
And I had other people who, I don't know that they're here this evening, but I had people who, analysts, read the book for me, just to make sure that, I wasn't falsifying things. And actually, most of them said that they thought I had been able to render what goes on in an analysis convincingly anyway, so I was happy about that.
Yeah, I've been reading Adam Phillip's biography of Freud.
Oh, yes,
which
yes.
I like, actually. I think it's very interesting. And, the two books dovetail beautifully.
Yes, actually, because he's writing about the young Freud, isn't
yes,
it? It's
he's
called
writing
Becoming Freud.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I haven't read that, but I've read other things that he's written about Freud. And he's a very interesting writer, and certainly has some interesting things to say.
Now, did you go to Freud's house in Vienna? Or?
I did.
And did you go to the one in London?
It's the one in London that's really interesting.
I know.
I haven't seen that one.
The one
I
in
just
London?
No, I haven't.
I've been to that one, but I haven't been to
But the one in Vienna, because obviously I'm sure the Freud family didn't feel particularly kindly towards the Viennese. If any of you followed what happened there during the Second World War,
Right.
they didn't exactly cover themselves with glory. Yes, extraordinary. Yeah, and I do refer to that all the way through the book because I felt that was one of the things that Freud really doesn't bring up, and very seldom in his case histories does he talk about the racial tensions. We don't get the economic situation in Vienna or the social situation. Obviously, he was concentrating on what was new and revolutionary and what particularly interested him. So in some of the other case history, we have a little bit more about religion, because the Wolfman is a Russian and a Christian. But Dora, Ida Bauer was a Jewish girl, but he doesn't bring that up, and he talks about Christmas, and there's no real reference. And there's even the which was taken directly from the case history, her going and sitting before the painting of the Madonna.
Yes.
Yes. And so all of this must have been in his mind, but not on the page.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Adam Phillip says is that he was profoundly shaped by being this Jew who was part of the Enlightenment, secular kind of, trying to assimilate and to put distance between himself and the religion. But he, in general, he avoided politics to a great extent, So there isn't very much of a sense of the times lapping in.
Right. So that I had to, obviously read a lot of other books, and it's just such a wonderful period. It's very interesting. Vienna 1900. I mean, just so much was going on in the whole world of painting and writing, and it's a really interesting period.
Such a flowering, and at the same time, there's so much prejudice and hatred.
Yes.
Such nastiness, at the same time.
The mayor, Luger, who is finally voted in. So there was this kind of undercurrent which I don't know. I grew up in South Africa and lived in a world that, in some ways, was similar, where there was this sort of apparent civility, on the surface, but underneath there was this tension all the time of, real violence and cruelty that was going on. So not that different, really.
So it seems that that historical fiction is something that you like to do and that you do well, And what does it offer you?
Yes, well, again, it gives one the middle distance, right? Or I think it's Felix von Hardenberg who said that novels arise from the shortcomings of history. So it's in those cracks, if you will, that you can allow your imagination to embroider and to flourish. But you do have the facts, which gives you, it's not just always eternally digging into one's own self. You can get out of yourself a little bit, or imagine you're getting out of yourself, or find yourself through someone else. There's that, in the strange, you may find your own self.
Could I put forward another possibility?
Yes.
I think there's in your language a certain formal quality that is not slangy, not entirely contemporary, and when you write historical fiction, your syntax, your vocabulary, seems at ease, and you don't have to, pretend to speak only 2014 lingo.
Yes, well that's probably true, Philip. It's probably very astute observation. And I certainly noticed giving my young students, I gave them exercises to do, and I said, right from the point of view of any of the minor characters in the case histories, and there are lots of minor characters, governesses and nannies, or there's the wonderful sister in the Wolfman case who ultimately commits suicide, but is very brilliant and writes poetry and that. So I said, right from their point of view, but that they really had difficulty doing, in the sense that the language that came out was not the language of the time, because they were not brought up, I'm afraid, many of them were not brought up reading Charlotte Bronte, which is the way I was, or, I don't know, Henry James, or whatever the books were that we read when we were very young, George Eliot, or whatever. And I think the cadences of that language stays with you, so that it is, you write perhaps a different type of prose.
And what was it like for you to flash forward and tell us things that happen in the future? I mean, it's been said that Freud, the only kind of wisdom Freud believed in was hindsight wisdom. So here you actually moving forward and gaining hindsight.
Yes. Well, I was reticent about doing that. I wasn't sure if it would work or not. And there I was inspired, I think, by Muriel Spark. I don't know if you remember her, Miss Jean Brodie, actually, and she does that. She tells you, she's telling you about the girls now, but she also flashes forward to what they will become and how they, so-and-so who was no good at math at school but became very good at sex, or something like that, And it's wonderful, and it really worked. And I thought, well, I really want people to know what happened to these people are so important.
Their fate.
Yes, and people know some of that anyway. So I did it, and so far nobody has complained about it. But people don't like it when you jump around in time. I know it's disconcerting. So,
I like it. Okay, let's take questions. Yes.
I have a question. So as a fiction writer, when you're reading the cases that informed your writing, how much liberty do you give yourself to dramatize? And, in other words, like when you're creating a scene, you're having to give thoughts and ideas that's motivating the characters. And also, is there anything about having come to America when you did, in America gave full flower to Freudian analysis that inspired you?
Yeah, no, actually, I mean, to answer your second point first, I actually studied psychology in France, and that's where I first learned, and I was actually at the Salpêtrière. I did an internship there. So I was really very much aware, and I was very interested by Charcot and his whole, you know, these performances that they put on.
Right.
It was really like a theatre,
Yeah.
and all these very, you know, high society people would come and watch while he hypnotized, you know, these young women, and it really, you know, it seemed to me, I mean, obviously you can see this from two points of view, but there was something, you know, when you put somebody to sleep on a stage and make them do things, it's you know, not exactly correct.
Certainly not politically.
But anyway, so that's where so for me it was actually a turning back to a time in my life when I I was a young mother actually, and I first read this Dora case, Flying Through the Night, going out to South Africa on an airplane, and as I read it, I began to feel very ill. You know, because she comes with so many, she can't cough, she can't breathe, and all this. And I began to feel more and more ill, and I thought, oh my God, I'm just identifying completely with this poor young woman, and I'm becoming like her, and what is the difference, and all of this. But actually, when I arrived in South Africa, and my mother was there to meet me, she said, my God, you look terribly ill. And I actually was ill. I actually had caught the measles from my children.
So it wasn't from reading.
But it wasn't
Freud.
from reading.
You can't blame everything on it.
I can't blame everything on it. But so that to answer that, and your other question were wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Michael has a wonderful book coming out soon too, and he's going to be talking here, right? So anyway, the first part of well, how much do you make up? I try not to ever falsify anything. You know, if there's something that's known, you can't say, you know, that it didn't happen or make it. But there's so much that's not known. Whenever you write about anybody, even if you write about your nearest and dearest, you know, there's so many mysteries that remain unsolved. So there's always a place to go, questions that you want answered.
Yes, questions.
Yes.
Well, I was glancing over your book where you said that Dora had symptoms like constipation and all that.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did.
I'm wondering, was there any real serious attempts to find out if there were physical causes for nervous withdrawal?
Right, what was really wrong with her. Yes, and I think that people have come up with various theories, and some people felt that she actually may have suffered from an appendicitis. And I think I bring that up at one point. She really does go to the encyclopedia to find out what the symptoms are. I mean, she was a very smart lady, this woman. And I got this from outside sources that this woman was particularly brilliant. And so she may actually have been, you know, because Freud goes into a whole long thing about, because she says that this started 9 months after the scene at the lake, after this man has attempted to seduce her, she gets these pains, and she says 9 months. So he immediately says, oh, well, it's a pregnancy. And then she's got her foot that's sort of, she's got a pain in her leg or something, and he says, oh, well, that's a false step. You made a false step. So you got pregnant, and that was the false step. You know, the causality in the whole thing. I mean, maybe he was right, I don't know. But anyway, it was, yeah.
What was I mean, later on in her life, after she left Freud, is there any record of her physical changes?
Well, I think she did suffer from, she continued to suffer from some of the things like constipation, for example. She did. And that may have been, you know, part of her makeup, I don't know. But certainly she was an extraordinary brave woman. She was an extremely domineering and very ambitious mother, and got her young boy to, they had to speak English one year, they spoke Italian the next year. I mean, she really prepared him so that he was to be, and in music they would walk to go to the opera if the, you know, this was obviously a woman in control of this boy, which was really all she had, so that she could control. Yes.
Yes, I would like to know if you consider this novel as a satire about a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, and also like you wrote on page 170, you were kind of critical about psychotherapies and interpretation of things like more or less like an intellectual or scientific fraud.
Oh no, I don't think that at all. No, not at all, not at all. After all of psychotherapy has come out of Freud. It has. And psychotherapy is extremely useful, I believe. And I think that today, and I get this from my husband, of course, who tells me that the young doctors and the young therapists don't always know how to talk to people. They've lost the art because it's so easy to give a pill. You know, so much is psychopharmacology today. And so that this is an art that's being lost, but the art of listening to someone is always at the basis of every, it seems to me, any interaction with a doctor. You have to listen to what you're, yes.
I love the book, and at the end of the book, Dora is very neglected by her son. And do you see that as a parallelism with the way she treated her father?
Ah, yes, I will. You're probably right. You're probably right. Although, I mean, she was extremely devoted to him, but then she got extremely angry with the whole family, which understandably so. He was trying to basically sell her. You know, there was a quid pro quo. You take my daughter and I'll take your wife. So it's very understandable that she should have been very angry with her father, I think. But the father, I think, was actually, to give him his due, he was a wealthy man at that point anyway, and he, when she marries a would-be musician. He really does give him a job, supports him. He even at one point hires an orchestra so that he can conduct this man who's really not very good. He's not really a great musician. It's the son who becomes the good musician.
I think that there are gray areas that in the case history that one could interpret differently, but you actually seem to feel that this was a kind of quid pro quo and everything, instead of that that one could interpret that these undercurrents were there, but that it wasn't actually quite as cut and dried as that. You also accepted that Freud did have an affair with his sister-in-law, with Minna.
Yes, yes.
Martha's sister. So, but you wrote about it in a very elliptical way.
Yes, yes. Well, that wasn't really my focus, but I think probably, I mean, they do have the fact that they both signed the guest book at some inn, and they got one room. That wasn't, you know, they didn't get two rooms, and they were together in this room and signed in as you know, the husband and wife. So I think that probably is fairly conclusive.
Sort of a smoking gun, yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering if in your teaching of the case histories as short stories and then for your own novel, if the issue of Freud as a stylist came to the fore in the classes, because he may come across as an arrogant personality, but he's an extraordinary stylist.
Yes.
Your voice is very different from his, of course, but it is his sense of metaphor, for example, is
Yes, no, it's true. He's a wonderful writer. Well, he got the Goethe Prize, right? He got the Goethe Prize, not the Nobel. And they are wonderfully written, these. I mean, it's the case histories that I know particularly well. But you know, you can really study them if you want to study technique. For both a fiction and a non-fiction writer, I think they are very illuminating, and of course, as we said, you know, this voice that he has, this really direct voice, and which probably came also from just writing so much. I mean, he wrote such a great deal. And listening so carefully, which he really did listen. And I think that these young women that he writes about in his early studies,
Studies in Australia.
yes, that he had really listened to them and he'd learned something from them. Nobody else was listening to these women. And he learned a lot about human nature from these women who were willing to tell him, which perhaps men might not have.
Yes.
Sheila, I have a question just about the craft of surviving and finishing a whole novel and doing historical research. When I think about the kinds of historical research you would have done before the internet, it strikes me as a wonderfully grounding, inspiring activity, absorbing, reading, focusing, and now with the internet, when you get on the computer, it sort of is very frazzled and scattered, and you've got a million things. And I'm just so curious because there were so many historical artifacts you came across that seem to have been so key. I mean, did you use the internet? I mean, did you literally open up Google and type Ida Bauer stuff about Freud? And then just in terms of your craft and process, because I find the internet frazzling and distracting, and the old kind of research of 20 years ago very focusing. I was wondering if you could talk about the craft.
Yes, well, I think I did a bit of both. I mean, the internet really is extremely helpful. That's how I found this wonderful article where the son talks about his life in Vienna, which gave me a lot of information about her later life. But obviously I read the texts and the letters. The letters are wonderful. If you're researching someone, that's one of the best sources, I think, because they were so direct. His letters to Fliess, which actually were, some of them were not published until fairly recently, because they do give away so much. And Freud really wanted to burn them. He tried very hard to get hold of them and to get them burned. But they were saved, again, by some women, actually, who had bought them up and who would not give them up. But anyway, so I did both. And I couldn't, just research and then write the book. I was researching, and then it would inspire me and I would write something. And then I would do a bit more research and write a bit more. Sort of on and off. I couldn't just sit down and research for a year and then write a book. I don't know how other people do this, but
Same way.
you work similarly. Otherwise, it's too difficult. And it's true, the internet, there's stuff all over the place, but it can also be extremely helpful.
Any other questions? I'll just ask one more, which is your general thoughts on fiction and non-fiction and their relationship to each other.
Well, you're the one who can answer that much better.
Yes, but I'm the one who's asking.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I've read what you've said on this, and I agree with you, and I think they are different. There are people who say it's just the same thing, it's exactly the same thing. Although people who are writing fiction are actually writing non-fiction, the people who are writing non-fiction are actually writing fiction. But I do think that if you present something as non-fiction, you've got to stick with facts. And Philip's written a wonderful essays about that. And he points out in one of his essays how the facts actually are very important and keep you grounded. And I think you're right on that. And it is, of course, something that, this was something that my young students who I had, math majors, I had a wonderful young Chinese kid who was obviously very brilliant at math, and so everybody else in the class told me. And he really read the text, and he would come up with all these questions about the footnotes. He read every little footnote, he read every word, and he wanted to know, but did Freud actually think this was, true, what he was saying? And, he was very literal in his approach. which was a little bit hard for me, but I tried to. But I think that's right in a way, and I do think you can criticize these case histories from a scientific point of view. Obviously, you can say, you know, has anybody ever remembered something from when they were 18 months old, and were they able to remember in that detail that they saw that the mother was that it was a violent act, but the mother was actually had a look of an enjoyment on her face. You know, I mean, could you possibly remember that at 18 months? I mean, think of a toddler. You know, but so I agree with you on this. I think they're different, but I think there are lots of things that are very similar. And telling of a story, you tell a story, you know how to structure it, you use all the tricks of the trade that both fiction writers and non-fiction writers can use.
Yeah, well, it's been said that one of the purposes of psychotherapy is to make a tellable myth of your life. So Freud was very aware of how we make myths and stories out of our past. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.